In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, there were 3 major crises that struck the United States. 3 things that kind of fell out of the blue, took Americans by surprise. 2 of these crises afflicted much of the world. And it's worth asking, was there a connection between these? Or, I mean, we'll see that they don't seem to have much in common, but if they don't have much in common, does the influence of the 3 have much in common? Just the fact that relatively discrete events could have huge consequences. A fair question to ask, is the world, is the United States becoming more vulnerable to crises like this? Okay, so the 3 in order are the terrorist attacks of 9/11, that is September 11th, 2001. That's the first one. The financial crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009. That's the second one. And the third one is the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, 2019, 2021. So let's look at these in order and see what we can make of them. So the first one, the terrorist attacks of 9/11. This was something that happened to the United States. Now, terrorism as a political phenomenon had been around for a while. In fact, it's been around forever and ever. What's terrorism? It is the inflicting of violence, typically lethal violence, against individuals, very often non-combatants, for the purpose of making a political statement. So you kill people not because those people are threatening you directly, not because they are soldiers. If they're soldiers, then it's an act of war. An act of terrorism is typically you kill civilians, non-combatants, to make a political point. And the terrorist attacks of 9/11 were conducted by militants of the Al-Qaeda group, led by Osama bin Laden. These were Islamic militants who believed that, Islamist militants, who believed that the United States wielded far too much influence in the land that was holy to Muslims, particularly Saudi Arabia, but in the Middle East generally. And the point was to strike a blow against the United States. In the belief of the terrorists, the United States had been waging war against Islam, against Arabs, in the Middle East, and it was time to take the war to the Americans, to make Americans feel what it was like to be in the crosshairs. So this led to the hijacking of jetliners filled with fuel that took off from airports on the East Coast and flew. 2 of them crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. 1 of them crashed into the Pentagon. Another was headed toward Washington, circling back toward Washington, but it was brought down apparently by the passengers on board before it could hit its target. Its target might have been the White House, it might have been the Capitol. But in terms of terrorist effect, to strike at the ground zero of American capitalism, Wall Street, the World Trade Center, it had quite an effect. It demonstrated that the greatest economic power on earth was vulnerable to attack by people, by groups, who had less in the way of wealth, who had less in the way of ordinary military power, but could still strike a blow. And then the blow at the Pentagon, well, if you're objecting to American militarism, American imperialism, then go after the Pentagon. That makes perfect sense. And if the 4th plane would have hit the White House or the Capitol, that would have struck directly at the heart of the American government. Okay, so those were the attacks. Americans, needless to say, were shocked. I think pretty much every American above the age of about 10 who was alive then can remember where he or she was when they got the news. And I was about to teach a class, and this was in 2001. It was when the internet was becoming available, but people didn't have, smartphones hadn't been invented yet. And so I went in, somebody told me that something had happened in New York, and so I went into the computer lab, and I was able to go online and get the streaming video from, I think it was CNN. And In fact, I was there when the second plane flew into the Twin Tower. And, well, so when the first plane hit one of the towers, the assumption was that this was a terrible accident, that somehow the plane had gotten out of control and it hit the tower. And there was grave concern for the people in the tower because the plane had crashed into about maybe 3/4 of the way up the tower, and it had set the building on fire. And if you were in one of the floors above where the plane had hit, well, things looked pretty grim because the fire spread and there might not be any way to get out. What nobody realized at the time was that this actually compromised the structural integrity of the building, so that when the fires burned through and it weakened the steel pillars holding up the upper stories, they would cave in, and then the upper stories would come down and pancake down on the lower stories, acting like a sledgehammer and sending the whole thing to the ground. So nobody realized that was in store, but at first people thought it was an accident. But then when the second plane hit, you put two and two together and realize, wait, you don't get two accidents like this. And then there were reports that there was the plane that crashed into the Pentagon, and so it was really clear that the country was under attack. At first, nobody knew what the extent of the attack was. President George W. Bush was traveling, and he got the news while he was he's sitting in a classroom with a bunch of school kids. And he was immediately put on Air Force One and sent into the air, and he was not allowed to come to Washington at first. Because, in fact, if that plane had been targeting the White House, nobody wanted him there when the next plane crashed into the White House. So he was sort of kept circling for a while until people could figure out what had happened. And it took a long time to figure out what exactly had happened. The immediate effects were to shut down the American, in fact, much of the world's air traffic system, because those planes had been part of the regular air traffic system, and they had come crashing into buildings, and at least immediately, nobody knew if there were other planes who were going to do something like that on other cities, perhaps, maybe even in other countries. And so there are fascinating videos there are maps that you can go on, you can see these on the internet, and they show what planes are in the sky at any particular time. And all the planes just disappeared from the sky. They were given quick orders to land at the nearest airport to where you are. Don't keep flying. And so the planes just left the air. And the American system of air travel was paralyzed, and nobody got on planes for a while. I mean, definitely several days after this. People were stranded in far parts of the country. I had happened to be in Washington just the day before this, and I came home to Texas with no idea that anything unusual was going to happen. But if I hadn't gotten home, I probably wouldn't have gotten home for 2 or 3 weeks, because planes didn't fly at first, and then when the planes did start flying again, there was such a backlog of people who wanted to get home that it took forever. So immediately there was a disruption to the American air traffic system, and Americans were alarmed. Obviously they would be, and this was a great tragedy. Nearly 3,000 people died in the attacks. It was the biggest loss of American life on a single day since Pearl Harbor. And then there's the question of, so what does the government do about it? What does the government do about it? What do the American people do about it? It was clear that something new had happened. Something had changed. This was 10 years after the end of the Cold War, and Americans had been searching for, and the American government had been searching for, some kind of theme to American foreign policy comparable to the Cold War. So during the period of the Cold War, Americans knew what the threat to the United States was. It was the threat of Soviet aggression, or a nuclear war triggered by trouble with the Soviet Union, or something like that. The thing to oppose was communism. Well, the Cold War ended, and American foreign policy just kind of went this way and that, just swinging from one direction to the other, until 9/11. And in 9/11, it became apparent that there was a new threat to the United States, and the threat was terrorism. Very often it was prefixed with Islamist terrorism because that's what Al-Qaeda was about. And people remember that there had been previous terrorist attacks. There was an attack on an American warship, the Cole, the previous year. There had been an attempt to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993. So terrorism didn't come out of nowhere, but all of a sudden there had been this big attack on the American homeland that had succeeded. And no one knew if this was just the first of many. Were there going to be other ones in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 months, how long? Is this going to be the new normal? Every time there's a big crisis like this, people ask themselves, is this a one-time thing? Or is this something we're going to have to get used to? The President of the United States, George W. Bush, had to figure out how to respond. One of the first things that he did was to tell Americans, we're all in this together. He went to the rubble of the World Trade Center and stood there and, Americans have come together and we will get the people who did this. And one of the first things that President Bush did was to order an American invasion of Afghanistan. Why Afghanistan? Because Afghanistan was the country where the Al-Qaeda terrorists had trained for their attack. And so the American troops went into Afghanistan, and almost no one criticized this part of the response after all. If a country, Afghanistan was run by the Taliban, this Islamist fundamentalist group that was willing to allow the Al-Qaeda terrorists, who happened to be from Saudi Arabia, they weren't from Afghanistan, but allowed them to train there. And so if the government of Afghanistan could not keep out these bad folks who were going to attack the United States, then the United States would go in and take out these folks themselves. And so pretty much everybody acknowledged that the United States was justified in sending troops into Afghanistan. The Afghanistan government, well, it didn't exactly acknowledge it. This country was being invaded, but they could hardly have been surprised. Now, they weren't happy because one of the first things that happened was they were overthrown. The Taliban was overthrown. And thus began America's war in Afghanistan that was still going in a much lower way almost 20 years later. Anyhow, so that part of the reaction seemed justified to most people. Almost nobody in the United States criticized the president for that. There was some concern and dissatisfaction that the American troops did not succeed in capturing Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda. He seemed to have been cornered in some caves in a far corner of Afghanistan, but somehow he got away. And so the hunt began for Osama bin Laden, which didn't end for another decade when he was finally killed in a raid in Pakistan. This was under the Obama administration. But America seemed to have a new enemy. And the enemy was terrorism. Now, when I say America had a new enemy, one of the phenomena that accompanied the Cold War was a notion that America had this enemy. And the enemy was the Soviet Union or Soviet communism or something like this. There was this focus of evil. That's what Ronald Reagan called communism, the focus of evil, and the Soviet Union is the focus of evil in the modern world. And it raised questions whether people, countries, need enemies. Or if they don't need enemies, if they find enemies convenient. And in fact, it was convenient to be able to say, okay, the bad stuff that's happening in the world comes from the communists over there. Then there was that period in the 1990s where bad stuff, confusing stuff was still happening in the world, but there was no single focus, there was no single enemy to zero in on. Then comes 9/11, and all of a sudden, America focuses on terrorism. And, well, there's a problem with this, because terrorism isn't a group of people, it's this concept, and there was some question whether the appropriate response was a war on terrorism. This is what the Bush administration declared, a war on terrorism. But terrorism is a political tactic. How can you declare war on a tactic? It's not even an ideology like communism. And the United States never declared war on communism per se. But a war on terrorism, well, it was really tempting and it was psychologically satisfying because terrorists had attacked the United States, so the United States needs to strike back. So terrorism became the focus of America's attention in foreign policy for the next, well, arguably for the next 10 or 15 years. American troops went into Afghanistan, and they stayed there for a long time because it was easy enough to overthrow the Taliban, but it was pretty hard to put in a stable, enduring Afghanistan government as a substitute. And so as of early 2021, the Taliban and the Afghanistan government and the United States were still negotiating as to what was going to be the outcome of all of this. It looked as though the Taliban could not be kept out of power forever. And it looked as though American troops would not remain in Afghanistan forever. So how that would be resolved remained to be seen. But for, I'll say, the next 10 years, Americans had this focus of now we know where the enemy is. The trouble is, again, to say the enemy is terrorism, well, this could take all sorts of forms. And since Al-Qaeda, these were Islamist terrorists, okay, then it became, in some minds, a war on Islam. Well, that wasn't very helpful because there were a lot of Muslims in the world who were allies, or at least partners, or at least friendly toward the United States. And declaring war on a religion, oh boy, that simply fed into the ideology and the dialogue of Al-Qaeda, which had said that the West and the United States had declared war on Islam. And the position of the government was, no, this is no war against Islam. This is war against these bad people who do these bad things, not a whole religion. But, well, if anything, it seemed that Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda terrorists, they sort of succeeded in their effort. Because, first of all, they killed a bunch of people, so they made a statement, we are strong, we can do this. But it seemed to draw the United States into the conflict on the terrorist terms. And so there was talk of, the United States was in this clash of civilizations with Islam. And anyway, so there was that. But then the United States government, George W. Bush's administration, decided to invade Iraq. Now, Iraq had no credible connection to the Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks of 9/11. In fact, Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, was vehemently opposed to Al-Qaeda and didn't like terrorists at all. He was no Islamist fundamentalist. He was a secular government. But the Bush people, the people in the Bush administration, had a grudge against Saddam Hussein for years, dating back to the 1980s and early 1990s. And it seemed a convenient way to sweep these two things together and to get rid of the government of Saddam Hussein. So one of the follow-on effects of the terrorist attacks of 9/11 was the invasion of Iraq. Now, at the time, it seemed like an easy way to do away with this bad guy, Saddam Hussein, but the war in Iraq got deeper and more confusing, and it dragged on, and it destabilized much of the Middle East. There are people today who still defend the invasion of Iraq, but most observers who don't have any dog in the fight would say, boy, that wasn't a very smart thing to do. It cost the United States lots of money, it cost lots of lives, and it made the situation in a fairly unstable region of the Middle East even more unstable. So anyway, there's 9/11. That's the first crisis, and those are some of the consequences. We live with some of the consequences today whenever you go to an airport today. And you have to go through heightened security. That kind of security did not exist before 9/11. And it exists after because those terrorist attacks of 9/11 involved airplanes. And people have sometimes thought, well, boy, this was an overreaction, or do we still need to do this? Because here's the key thing. The question for years was, is there going to be a second 9/11? And there wasn't. There hasn't been. And so was that a discrete thing? For a time, it looked as though that's the new normal. But it hasn't recurred. There have been other terrorist attacks. There have been lots of terrorist attacks, nothing as big and spectacular. And they have been, but they haven't made use of airplanes. So maybe the focus was too much on airports and not on other things. Okay, stop with that. Second crisis, crisis number 2, the financial crisis of, I'll focus on 2008. This was when the American financial system imploded. It had to do with a real estate bubble that burst, but companies, banks, financial institutions had loans out that weren't being repaid. They couldn't repay the loans that they had, and it looked as though the United States was on the brink of a financial collapse to challenge that of 1929, the great crash of 1929, and the crash of 2008. It wasn't just 2008. The real estate market the bubble burst in 2007, and it filled into 2008. And it really looked as though something that people had thought for 30 years, that the folks who run American, and not just American, but sort of Western, rich country, financial policy, fiscal policy, those folks know what they're doing. And there won't be another stock market crash like 1929. In fact, I had been teaching for some years in 1987, so think of this. And in the decade that I'd been teaching till then, I would say that, okay, there's not going to be a stock market crash like 1929, and it's not going to lead to a Great Depression like the 1930s, because we, that's collectively the people who are in charge of this, have figured out how to prevent this kind of thing. And I remember I'd given that lecture to a class. This is in the autumn of 1987. And I walked out of the class to hear news reports that the stock market had collapsed and had fallen a huge amount in just several hours. A larger amount in just a few hours than had occurred in 1929. Oh boy, got to rethink that. I'm going to have to rewrite that lecture. However, this was 1987. The reason you don't hear about the stock market crash of 1987 and the financial crisis of 1987 is precisely what I'd been saying, that the people in charge know what to do. So the measures were taken to prevent this momentary stock market collapse from creating a broader collapse of all the financial system of the country, and a depression followed. So there was no Great Depression of 1988. And it seemed to confirm what I'd been saying. Well, then comes 2008. And this one is bigger than 1987. And furthermore, it defied the ability of the government to contain it up to a point. It was a financial crisis, and the financial crisis was worse than anything since the great stock market crash of 1929. But governments did respond. They couldn't prevent a recession, and it was a sharp recession, just a matter of terminology here. A depression, a recession, they both refer to a decline in economic activity. Nobody uses the term depression anymore because it's too alarming. It brings back memories of the 1930s where the Depression went on for a whole decade. But there have been recessions, and the one that started in 2008 was the worst recession since World War II in the living memory of just about everybody then. And it took a long time for things to recover. The American economy required, well, almost a decade to get back to where it had been before 2008. And it did get back. It was a slow recovery. It was a painstaking recovery. And one of the lessons learned was that, there still are bubbles, and the bubbles burst. People get too excited about their speculations. They bid prices too high, and the markets can't sustain the prices, and eventually the bubble bursts, and you have to deal with a reckoning. However, and this is crucial, that the financial crisis of 2008 did not lead to a Great Depression of the 2010s, the way the financial crisis of the stock market crash of 1929 led to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And this, again, seemed to underscore that, okay, we've figured this out. We, the people who run the Federal Reserve, the people who run the Treasury, central banks in other countries, parliaments in other countries, Congress, and so on. That, okay, so we know what we're doing. However, it still meant that a lot of people were out of work for a long period of time. It meant that the idea of just a smooth and steady growth in the American economy or the economies of the rich world or other countries, there's no reason to think it was going to be like that. That there would be these ups and downs, and maybe it goes up and comes down. It doesn't go as far down as it did during the Great Depression. But the financial folks of the world have not figured out how to prevent the economy from just having these huge hiccups every now and then, and throwing millions of people out of work and setting overall production back, for years, and causing stock markets to plummet, and people get really nervous about this. Now, the question then is, was that just a one-time thing? Was like the question after 9/11, was this terrorist attack a one-time thing, or is this going to be a new normal? This is going to happen again and again. In the case of the terrorist attack, it didn't. At least, I should say, It didn't yet. There were smaller attacks. There were sort of retail attacks, one-on-one, a few people getting killed, maybe a dozen in a few cases, but nothing like the thousands. And after the financial crisis of 2008, the financial crisis, we haven't had another one until, we'll get to what I'm going to say in just a moment. But so it seemed to be a one-time thing, and nobody really thought there would be no more of these, but it looked as though we rode this one out and we figured out what to do about it. Okay, then along comes COVID-19. Now again, this is one that just came out of the blue. Did it really? So I had said with regard to 9/11, there had been previous terrorist attacks, but nobody took it as seriously until 9/11 came along. In the case of the recession, the financial crisis of 2008, there's a whole history of financial panics and crises going back to the 19th century. But people thought that maybe we figured out how to prevent these. No, we hadn't. With regard to a pandemic. Well, pandemic just means an epidemic that goes everywhere, all around the world. Pan means all, everywhere. So a pandemic, there had been new viruses that had threatened to produce pandemics several times in the decade before 2019. But they had always been contained. They'd always been corralled before they could spread broadly. And just as in the period before 9/11, so people in the US government, the American people generally knew that there was a chance of a terrorist attack. But until the big thing happens, nobody really takes it seriously. Or to put it another way, if you're in government and you've got lots of problems to deal with, and preventing a 9/11 attack will require the spending of billions of dollars that's hard to come by, well, because you don't know it's going to happen, it's easy to say, no, I'll spend that money elsewhere where I know it'll have an effect. Because if I spend it here preventing a 9/11, maybe there never was going to be a 9/11. So the same thing is true with a pandemic. There had been these outbreaks of new viruses, but they had always been contained. And so people had this notion that, okay, the health officials, they know what they're doing and they'll be able to contain it. Well, it didn't happen with COVID-19 and the pandemic that this produced. And so what we have is this worldwide epidemic. There had been pandemics before. The closest analogy in the past before this one was the outbreak of so-called Spanish flu, influenza, in 1918, 1919, into 1920. And it spread all around the world, but because transportation, communication was much slower in those days than it is today. It was as though it was unfolded in slow motion. There was no air travel to speak of, so people had to get on ships. Well, now they can travel, and the virus can go halfway around the world in just a few hours. And so this new phenomenon of a worldwide epidemic, really a worldwide epidemic, and the effects that it had on economies, the effects that it had on people's interactions with everybody else, it accomplished something that had never happened in American history before, in the history of other countries, and that is just almost shutting down, not entire economies, but forcing a reconfiguration and rethinking of economies. This had never happened before. And the question immediately was, is this a one-time thing? If it's a one-time thing, then we'll deal with it and then we'll go back to normal. But if this is the new normal, if this is going to happen again and again, and now people began to look back at those earlier new viruses that came along and say, boy, we were really lucky that those didn't spread. Maybe this pandemic is the new normal. And so there are all sorts of questions that surround this. Will more education, for example, be online? Because we can deal with that pandemic or not. Some people think, well, okay, even it's a good idea even absent a pandemic. Will businesses conduct themselves via Zoom in education as well? Will there be more sort of not face-to-face, but via Zoom, digital meetings, virtual meetings? Is this going to be the new norm? Are people going to travel less? Is there going to be less business travel than there was before? Is the airline industry going to go bankrupt because it's been based on this model that there's all this traffic, but not so many people are traveling? So we're at a moment in the early part of 2021, where we don't know the answer to this. One thing we can take from this, from 9/11, from the financial crisis of 2008, from the pandemic of 2020 and 2021, is that these things have a global impact to a much greater degree than they used to. So something that happens in one part of the world quickly goes to another part of the world. The world is, in this respect, this is an overused metaphor, but the world is smaller than it used to be. What happens in one part of the world can quickly have important ramifications for another part of the world. But is this the new normal? Well, this is one where historians say it all the time, but it's really true. We're going to have to wait and see.